This is Unit 8B, Part 2. There are some anatomical changes that occur. The areola darken, as early as 1 to 2 weeks, but usually it's later, but it could be as early as 1 to 2 weeks. Breasts enlarge starting 6 to 8 weeks and progressively enlarge as the pregnancy progresses. There is also a change in the lining of the vagina in that it develops more of a purplish color or hue. And this is called Chadwick's sign and can occur 6 to 8 weeks into pregnancy. Of course, the uterus expands until it actually occupies a large part of the abdominal cavity. Common change to the in the female is lordosis, shown in the diagram here, where you have this sort of sloped in posture, just because the center of gravity is forcing the woman to lean kind of backwards and arch her back out forwards, just to be balanced. There is also a hormone released further as pregnancy progresses. It's called relaxin. It's produced by the placenta, and it helps to make the ligaments in the pelvis relax and widen, become more flexible to accommodate the pregnancy and future delivery. The pubic symphysis is here right in the center. I put that in the diagram right there in the center, and the ligaments holding that also widen and relax. Total typical weight gain towards the end of pregnancy can be as much as increase of 13, typical rather, not as much as, but a typical weight gain is 13 kilos. Okay, and this just shows the progression in terms of the size of the uterus. It gets very large, occupying most, with the fetus inside, of course, occupying most of the abdominal cavity. The glandular tissue in the mammary glands also enlarges, and therefore breasts enlarge. Okay. So in terms of hormones, there are a number of hormones that are produced during pregnancy. They're listed on this slide and the next slide. Only I focus on just a few. Human placental lactogen, or HPL. It has other names, but HPL is a fairly common name for it. It stimulates the maturation of the breasts, helps with growth of the fetus, and has a change in causes a change in maternal glucose metabolism. This is called glucose sparing. I'm not going to get into the details of that in terms of metabolism. Let's just leave it with maturation of the breasts through pregnancy and helping with growth of the fetus. Let's see what's on the next slide in terms of hormones. An important one to remember is the hormone HCG, human chorianogonadotropin, in that it's not so much the role of it. I'm not going to mention that right now, but in the fact that it helps maintain the corpus luteum instead of the corpus luteum involuting and becoming a corpus albicans. It continues being alive due to HCG, but also the fact that HCG is the very first hormone that can be detected with pregnancy and is the basis of pregnancy tests that are done on urine. Female pees on the stick, and if there's a color change, that indicates that there is in fact HCG in her urine. These are very, very, very sensitive tests. I don't know if it was slide 27. I just talked about relaxin. I'm not sure if that number is correct because I did change this. I did add some slides and remove others, so I'm not sure, but we just discussed it. You can correct that on your own. Of course, there's estrogen and progesterone produced by the corpus luteum, and later the placenta takes over. So the placenta does secrete it, but first the corpus luteum does. Let's move on. There are physiological changes certainly in the pregnant female. The GI tract changing is that a typical change is morning sickness, believed to be due to HCG, estrogen, progesterone levels increasing. There can be heartburn because of the increased upward pressure on the stomach. In terms of the urinary system, urinary production increases, and that's because of the additional fetal waste, the additional tissue that's generating waste, and the woman has to pee it out in the urine. Also, there's pressure, a lot of pressure on the bladder, so a pregnant female can't allow her, she'll have enough pressure on her bladder that it feels full much earlier than normal, and so she has frequency, meaning she has to go to the washroom quite often. In terms of the respiratory system, often nasal congestion, edematous nasal congestion. There's a actually an increase in tidal volume, so the average breathing at rest is larger. Sometimes there's difficulty breathing or dyspnea, and that may develop late in pregnancy. I imagine that late in pregnancy you could understand why that might occur. A woman might have difficulty breathing. Okay. In terms of the cardiovascular system, there's a blood volume increase of 25 to 40%, significant increase in blood volume by the 32nd week. A normal pregnancy goes 40 weeks. Venous return from the lower limbs can be impaired because of the distension due to the pregnancy and the pressure on the veins, and that can often result in varicose veins and edema in the lungs. In the lungs? In the legs, not lungs. All right. So let's talk about parturition. This is labor, female going into labor. The initiation of labor, or parturition. One of the earliest things is that the fetal cortisol levels rise, and that helps trigger maturation of the fetal lungs. And part of that maturation process is that the fetus starts to produce surfactant, which acts as a surface tension reducing detergent-like molecule in the lungs, so that when the baby is born, it is able, without too much struggle, to inflate the lungs. That's one of the major problems with preemies or premature babies, is that their lungs have not fully developed, and they don't have adequate amounts of premature babies. They don't have adequate amounts of surfactant production in their lungs. The cortisol level from the fetus that's nearing full term, also triggers an increase in estrogen levels, reaching a peak in the last few weeks of pregnancy. That estrogen will induce oxytocin receptors in the expression of oxytocin receptors in the uterus. I would remind you that oxytocin is a hormone which is synthesized and released from the hypothalamus, and it is exported out of the hypothalamus into the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, where it's stored. So oxytocin actually has effects on the target organs, include the uterus and the and breast tissue. Before birth, it's the uterus, but the uterus has to start expressing oxytocin receptors in order to be ready to respond to it when it gets released. The estrogen also will trigger placental prostaglandin production, an important hormone towards the end of the pregnancy. There are often weak contractions. They're sporadic. They're not regular, repeated, or increasing in strength. They're sporadic uterine contractions and relaxations that can occur, and some people call them false pregnancy contractions. These are called Braxton-Hicks contractions. As the time for delivery approaches, as birth nears, oxytocin prostaglandin levels will cause uterine contractions, real contractions of the uterus. And this sets up or triggers a positive feedback loop, because the oxytocin and the prostaglandin will trigger uterine contractions, and uterine contractions can trigger oxytocin and prostaglandin release, which will then trigger more oxytocin prostaglandin release, triggering more contractions, etc., and it builds and builds and builds until the baby actually is delivered, and then it stops. That's how the woman goes into labor, and that's why oxytocin can be used to initiate labor. So sometimes it's also not called initiation, but induction or inducing labor. So sometimes they'll induce labor in a woman. They'll give her a small injection of oxytocin, and that triggers the uterine contractions, which trigger more oxytocin prostaglandin release, triggering more contractions. So they just start her off with a small initial injection. That's an induction. So they'll inject a small amount. But otherwise, this is what happens normally in a normal uninduced labor. Okay, clean this up a little. Here we go. Yeah, I hope you remember or recall that many of the hormones released in the body need to be first, the tissue that released them first has to be exposed to a releasing hormone. So in this case, we're looking here at an increase that happens towards the end of the pregnancy for initiation of labor. Fetal corticosteroid or cortisol releasing hormone is produced. That triggers fetal cortisol production, which raises placental estrogen, and then you get triggering of prostaglandin release, and prostaglandin release will stimulate the uterus to contract, which triggers oxytocin release from the posterior lobe of the woman's pituitary gland, and then that will trigger more uterine contraction, more stretching. Also, the cervix occurs with right here, the cervix, and this is a positive feedback loop that intensifies and intensifies and intensifies until the baby is born. I mentioned earlier also that there is induction of oxytocin receptors in the uterus, which is important so that it can then respond to the oxytocin released later. These are the 3 stages of labor itself. Once a person goes into labor: the dilation stage, expulsion stage, and placental stage. We'll go through each of these in more detail in the next few slides. What you have in the dilation stage is that the cervix becomes dilated or stretched open. It will dilate. When fully dilated, it will have a 10 centimeter diameter opening or dilation. The initial contractions typically are anywhere from 15 in the uterus are anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes apart and can be 10 to 30 seconds long or duration. During all this, there is dilation of the cervix and effacement. It effaces, which means it gets thinner as it gets stretched out. At some point along the way here, the amnion will rupture, releasing amniotic fluid. So there's what people call as, people say, her water broke. There's a release of a flush of that clear amniotic fluid coming out. And then what happens is that you get, as the cervix dilates and the amnion ruptures and the head and the cervix is fully dilated and the head starts to appear, which means that there's engagement. That's called engagement, as the infant head appears and enters into the pelvis. Okay. The next stage is expulsion. You have full dilation and delivery, strong contractions now every 2 to 3 minutes, and contractions lasting about a minute in length. This can go on, actually the earlier stage can go on for longer than this. This is really towards the end. The urge to push increases even without any local anesthetic. There's a tremendous urge to push. Crowning occurs when crowning is the term for the largest diameter of the head distending the vulva out. So when the largest diameter of the head is appearing and stretching the vulva completely outwards. And that's like right at delivery, essentially. And then following that, the placenta and its attached fetal membranes are delivered. This is, some people call it the afterbirth, but it's actually a delivery of the placenta, and this is the placental stage. All placental fragments need to come out, need to be removed to prevent any potential postpartum bleeding. There's a lot of tissue that is separating away from the wall of the uterus, and it is of course highly vascular and needs to get sloughed off, and the vessels vasoconstrict, and you get clotting and prevention of further bleeding. Some women will bleed at this point in time. It's rare and it's extremely dangerous because of the large size of the wound. It's fair enough to call it a wound. It's open blood vessels, and actually it's quite terrible if they have a large hemorrhage. A postpartum bleed can be extremely dangerous. It can even exsanguinate. Okay, let's move on. Let's look at the baby now. Once it breathes, the first breath, very key. Once the baby is delivered, CO2 is no longer being removed from the tissues of the body, from the bloodstream of the baby, so the PCO2 rises and central acidosis occurs. And that is what triggers the respiratory centers in the brainstem of the baby to trigger the very first inspiration. So the baby is the baby has this sensory input detection of that high PCO2 and is driven to take that first breath, which does take a tremendous amount of effort. The airways are very small, they're very narrow, they can be filled with liquid or mucus, and the lungs are collapsed. Baby has to inflate its lungs. The surfactant there helps reduce surface tension, helps with that. But it takes quite a bit to get that first breath in. The respiration rate initially is extremely rapid and stays that way for the first 2 weeks. You have 45 breaths per minute. quite a rapid heart rate and also rapid respiration rate. Remember that in the circulation of the fetus, it has specialized structures, the ductus venosus, the ductus arteriosus, and the foramen ovale. And these undergo changes immediately upon birth. The umbilical arteries and veins, of course, constrict. They actually become fibrosed. They're filled with, it takes a little time for this to happen, but they constrict very tightly. The cord is cut, and you don't get bleeding because of that constriction. Eventually they become fibrosed. The blood vessels will change and become other names are given to them, and I don't need you to spend time learning these. That they become, some become the ligaments, some become other types of arteries. This becomes a ligament. This becomes a ligament. This becomes just this is the remnant of it, but it's okay. You don't have to know that name. It's enough for you to know that it closes. This also becomes a ligament. Most of these extra structures in terms of shunts that are vessels will become just a ligament. The connective tissue remains. It's no longer vascular tissue, but the connective tissue remains and becomes solid ligament. So all of these are functionally occluded completely within 30 minutes after birth. Let's use another color. This was the color I wanted to show. You didn't have to learn that material. Okay, it's there if you want it, but it's too much detail. With all of the circulatory special structures found in the fetus become functionally occluded, blocked, are no longer functioning because they get blocked within 30 minutes after birth, with the exception of the foramen ovale, which is between the right and left atria, and that will be completely occluded eventually by 1 year, usually earlier, but I would guess mostly, not usually, but mostly occluded, and that occlusion is completed after the first year, by the end of the first year. Okay, so the baby is born. It's undergone these massive physiological changes. You know, birth is a tremendous physiological challenge after all. So it undergoes this switch to breathing air and alterations in its vasculature, and quite a shocking introduction to life. And it needs to be evaluated. The infant's physical status is assessed immediately upon birth. There's someone taking care of the baby. There's someone taking care of the mother, or that's the way it should be. The baby is assessed on the basis of 5 signs. This is called an APGAR. Appearance, pulse, grimace response, activity, respiration. So for appearance, they're looking for skin color, whether it's a good pink skin color or if it's slightly blue or purplish, that's not good. Pulse, the proper heart rate. Remember, it does have a faster heart rate than certainly an adult, way faster. Little kids even have them. You know, a kid of 8 would have a faster pulse rate. It should have some sort of reflex, a grimace reflex. If stimulated, it should grimace. Some motion activities demonstrating muscle tone and respiration rate and effort to breathe in, making the effort to breathe in. Each of these observations is given a score of 0 to 2. And a healthy baby would have a score of 8 to 10. Anything lower it typically does reveal some sort of problem, particularly if it's much lower. But 8 to 10 is indicative immediately of a healthy baby. Every baby is assessed for these 5 key characteristics, the APGAR. Okay, so there is a transitional period immediately after birth in the first 6 to 8 hours. First 30 minutes, the baby is active, alert, the heart rate increases to 120 to 160, respiration rapid and irregular, temperature will fall, activity slows down, and the baby can sleep for up to 3 hours. And after that, the baby will typically regurgitate or bring up some mucus and debris that it had swallowed from the amniotic fluid. And after that, it sleeps and establishes a rhythm of waking up and feeding, being hungry, feeding, and going to sleep every 3 to 4 hours, which can persist for quite a while. Ask any new mother. It's quite tiring for her to if she's breastfeeding, certainly. And yeah, somebody has to take the care of the baby when it wakes up. It needs to be fed. So every 3 to 4 hours, they're going to wake up and want food. They have a high metabolic rate. Okay, that food is milk, and lactation is the production of milk from the breasts or mammary glands. The estrogen, progesterone produced by the placenta helps to, and also human placental lactogen will stimulate the hypothalamus, and that triggers the hypothalamus to, I reminded you that typically the hormones produced by different glands require a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces quite a few different releasing hormones. Well, releasing hormone for milk production is prolactin releasing hormone, or PRH. This is produced in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Posterior lobe, just to remind you, is producing the oxytocin. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary, I'll just write posterior lobe, the pituitary is producing oxytocin, and we talked about that. It also produces ADH, but we're not going to talk about that. Those are the two. It releases these, it stores them and releases them. These two come from the hypothalamus. All the others are being produced there are many others being produced by the hypothalamus. Among them, prolactin releasing hormone, which triggers the anterior lobe of the pituitary to produce and release prolactin. And it's the prolactin hormone which allows the mother to start production of milk. Complicated thing here. And this diagram actually shows a ribbon diagram of the it's a protein hormone. Prolactin is. That happens to be prolactin. Okay, so lactation requires prolactin. Prolactin is produced by the anterior lobe. Production is triggered by hypothalamic prolactin releasing hormone. And this is shown in this diagram. Here we have the hypothalamus producing prolactin releasing. Here they're calling it peptide. It is a peptide. It's a hormone, a peptide hormone. Prolactin releasing peptide or prolactin releasing hormone. I've seen it also as prolactin releasing factor, but it's prolactin releasing hormone. That acts on the anterior lobe of the pituitary to induce production of prolactin, and that has an effect on the alveolar cells and the lobes of the breasts, triggering milk synthesis. And this is the baby latching on to the nipple here. At the same time, we did talk about oxytocin. It's produced in the hypothalamus and secreted down and stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and latching on triggers. Latching on by the baby, or even the baby crying, will trigger the mother to start releasing oxytocin from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. that has an effect on the breast tissue. It has an effect on specialized cells in the breast called myoepithelial cells, which have the ability to contract. There's specialized contractile cells in the breast, and they allow for ejection of the milk. Okay, so without that trigger of oxytocin, the mother has milk but won't release it. So this helps with release or ejection, also called letdown of the milk. And both of these, prolactin and oxytocin, are triggered when the baby cries or latches onto the nipple. So milk production also, well, it's also stimulated by suckling action of the milk. Even crying, latching on, triggers oxytocin, allowing the milk letdown. And then the breastfeeding itself will trigger prolactin releasing hormone, PRH here, this, to get released. So you get pulsatile prolactin production. Every time the woman feeds the baby, every time the baby suckles, PRH is released and therefore prolactin, and therefore milk production occurs. If the mother does not regularly breastfeed, then this cycle will be broken and she'll stop producing milk. I don't know if, no, it's not the last slide. So lactation, an important aspect of lactation is the very first milk. The very first milk released in the first few days after birth of the baby is quite rich and yellow in color. It is called colostrum. And it's very rich in a number of constituents, particularly IgA class antibodies. This is, remember, there are 5 classes of antibodies, G, M, A, D, and E, and IgA antibodies. Antibody molecules that are the IgA class are found in secretions, in tears, in mother's milk, and perspiration, in the secretions, the mucus secretions of the gut and the respiratory tract. So in this case, the baby whose immune system has not developed fully at all is getting a naturally acquired passive immunity by taking in these IgA class antibodies with mother's milk. This is the most important thing perhaps in mother's milk that can help protect the baby. This provides a naturally acquired passive immunity. True milk production then follows that initial colostrum. There still is IgA antibodies in the milk. It also is rich in IgA, not as rich as colostrum, not quite as high in fats, which I think is why it's mostly yellow in color, but it's extremely important that the baby receive this. This is I hesitate to say, but it's true that the problem with bottle feeding as opposed to breastfeeding. Okay. That breast milk, as I said, has many advantages. It helps with absorption of fats and iron that are essential. There are amino acids that are found in mother's milk are metabolized more efficiently than those in cow's milk. Don't ask me why. I don't see what the difference would be. I don't know. The beneficial molecules particularly are involved, all of these actually, are involved in, all of these ones are involved in defense against infection. Also, there's anti-inflammatory molecules in that milk, and it also has a natural laxative effect. Babies sometimes get blocked up, and it's very painful for them. And this laxative effect will help clean the bowels of meconium. Meconium is the very, very first few bowel movements, the material in the first few bowel movements, and it's dark green in color. Quite a shock to some new parents when dark green stuff comes out. It's the material that the baby was swallowing all through pregnancy. The baby does swallow some of the fluid and some cell material, and it comes out after birth as dark green feces. Okay, that's the end of Unit 8B, Part 2.